Hello, welcome to Know the Faith, Defend the Faith. My name is William Hemsworth, and this is brought to you by the Tucson Institute of Catholic Apologetics. Very blessed and honored to have apologist Gary Michuta on the line today. Gary Michuta has a great radio program called Hands-On Apologetics on Virgin Most Powerful. Please check it out on the Virgin Most Powerful app and also on his website, handsonapologetics.com. Gary, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic.
Great. Thank you for coming on the program today. It's a great pleasure. And I know you've been engaged in Catholic apologetics for quite a while, I think since 1992. And you've done a lot of great work on what we Catholics call the Deuterocanon. And you've wrote some great books on it, why Catholic Bibles are bigger. Everyone check it out on catholicanswers.com. So let's just start from the beginning. What is the Deuterocanon?
Well, the Deuterocanon, consists of 7 books in the Old Testament that, and also 2 sections sections in Daniel and Esther that are found in Catholic Bibles and Orthodox Bibles, but they're not in Jewish or Protestant Bibles. So those books are, let's see if I can name them now: Sirach, Wisdom, Tobit, Judith, Baruch, First and Second Maccabees, and like I said, there's 2 chapters in Daniel and some sections in Esther. So those usually that's a term that Catholics, maybe Orthodox, use as those are Deuterocanonical books. For Protestants, they would call those same books Apocrypha.
Now, have they always been called Deuterocanonical books?
No, that wasn't until the late 1600s, I believe, or it might have been a little bit earlier than that. But no, they were just considered sacred scripture, really. There was, of course, there are some exceptions. Jerome, for example, was the first one to call them Apocrypha, and then there are some people who would follow them. But yeah, now that's kind of the current common terminology.
Okay, so Jerome was the first to actually coin did he coin the term Apocrypha? Was it in, how did that term come up?
Apocrypha means hidden, and generally it was meant that books that weren't read publicly in church as sacred scripture. And and the Deuterocanon had always been, with Christians, distinguished from the Apocrypha. It wasn't included with it because these books were read as sacred scripture, in Christian churches. And it wasn't until Jerome, he was the first early father to actually call them Apocrypha. And as I point out in my books, that he does so basically because of a mistake he makes. He's retranslating the scripture at that time into making a fresh translation of the Latin Vulgate, what becomes the Vulgate, and the Latin Bible. So he starts off with the Greek text, the Septuagint, and some other Greek texts. And he knows Hebrew, so he's reading the Greek and then trying to figure out what the Hebrew says. He goes to the Hebrew and then he puts into Latin. And essentially he thought, this is silly because we know what the original Hebrew is because there was only one type of manuscript available at that time. There was only one Hebrew manuscript. So he said, why am I fooling around with these Greek things when I could just go straight to the Hebrew? And if it isn't in this Hebrew manuscript, then it's Apocrypha. So the Deuterocanon wasn't part of that manuscript tradition, and so he was the first one to do that.
Okay, and it seems like that kind of carried on then through the Protestant Reformation and so forth. Were they kind of looking at Jerome to say, because he didn't consider it, then we're not going to?
Well, see, so immediately after he does this, now Jerome is translating the Vulgate. You can't translate the entire Old Testament at once, right? Obviously. So he translates a few books. He puts a preface on those books. It says Deuterocanon is Apocrypha. He sends it out. He does a couple more books. He puts another preface, sends it out. So he's kind of like broadcasting his opinion that these books aren't part of Scripture. Well, there is a reaction, especially in North Africa, which is a very important center of Christianity in the 4th century. And they react to this new translation of Jerome. And so that causes a series of local councils to meet to reaffirm the historic Christian understanding of the Old Testament. So those are the councils of, there's 2 councils in Carthage and a council of Hippo. They meet and they reaffirm the historic Christian canon against Jerome. And then also Pope Innocent I, sometime, I think it was around 402, also writes a letter that he affirms those canons. So there was this reaction by the church, no, this is what the sacred scriptures are. But the problem is, and this is really interesting, as the Latin Vulgate becomes the Bible in the West, the Latin-speaking West, anyone who studies scripture would read Jerome's prefaces, and in the prefaces, he makes no bones about his opinion about these books. So, so you have this like minority opinion that kind of trickles down that follows Jerome, or they try to reconcile Jerome with the church. So they have to mangle the language and stretch the term Apocrypha to basically include anything. So you get weird things like at the Council of Trent, you would have Catholic bishops arguing for the inspiration and canonicity of the Deuterocanon, calling it Apocrypha, because the word's basically meaningless at that time. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It wasn't until Martin Luther was, I think, cornered in a debate against a Catholic theologian named Johann Eck in a Second Leipzig Disputation. I think it's 1519. And it was on purgatory. And Eck cites a series of texts to prove purgatory. And the last text he cites is 2 Maccabees 12:46. It's a holy and wholesome thought to pray for the dead that they may be loosed from their sins. And what's interesting is Luther goes through and he disputes the interpretations. He tries to pick it apart. But when he comes to that 2 Maccabees, he doesn't dispute the interpretation. Instead, he says there's no proof of purgatory that can be taken from the scriptures that can be entered into debate and serve as proof. So from that point, he says, okay, you can't admit 2 Maccabees into debate. And then Eck pushes them, and then Luther appeals to Jerome. So that's kind of like how Jerome gets in. And then from Luther on, Jerome becomes a standard part of the Protestant argument.
Okay. And that's I asked because that's one argument that I used for years.
Oh, really? Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I used that argument until I just started studying history and saw, okay, well, they were considered scripture early on. Now, how about the early Jewish? How about the early Jewish folks? Did they consider it scripture? Was there evidence of that?
Yeah, well, we have to, many times people talk about the Jews as if Judaism was monolithic and never changed, okay, which is completely, totally false. You have to, in the first century, okay, Judaism was not monolithic. It was comprised of many different sects. All of them had different opinions about the exact, limits of sacred scripture. For example, the Sadducees seem to hold on to only the first 5 books of the Bible. And the Essenes actually hold on to, may not have accepted Esther, but they might have accepted Tobit and Sirach and some of their own writings as inspired. And so there was a wide variety. It was kind of what I call like fuzzy edges. Okay. It wasn't clearly defined because there wasn't a single Old Testament text that everybody used. And there wasn't a single sect that was the authentic expression of Judaism. So it's very hard to determine, you'd have to talk about which sect of Judaism accepted which books. And even then, it's a lot of guesswork. So it wasn't until actually the second Christian century that after the destruction of the temple and the failed first Jewish revolt, there was going to be a second Jewish revolt. And at that time, the head rabbi of a school in Yavne or Jamnia, he wanted to establish a single Hebrew text that would be normative throughout Judaism. Okay. And that eventually becomes the Hebrew text that Jerome had 400 years later. Okay. And that text was kind of like a Procrustean bed. Like any books that were outside of it were rejected, and any books that were disputed that were in it were affirmed as sacred. So books like Esther, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes. Jews disputed whether these books are sacred. Well, at that point, it became officially sacred. So there became a single normative text for Jews. And then from that point on, that becomes the rabbinical Bible. And so, from that point on, they would not view Sirach or Tobit or Maccabees as inspired text.
Okay. Now, was this in response to? I heard this theory before. I just want to run it by you.
Okay.
Was this kind of in response to the early Christians considering the Deuterocanon as scripture, where they said it was kind of a I don't want to say, it was kind of like a play against the Christians, saying, okay, these really aren't inspired because they're using them. I kind of heard that theory.
Yeah, well, there's lots of what do I want to say? There's lots of evidence that hints in that direction, because that rabbi I talked about, Rabbi Akiba, not only was he the first to establish this Hebrew text, but he was also instrumental in stopping or undermining the Septuagint, this ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament that was very popular amongst Jews. And actually in the New Testament, it was the probably the go-to source. If you read the New Testament, it usually quotes from this Greek Septuagint. And also around the time of that second revolt, Rabbi Akiba affirms a false Messiah named Simon Bar Kokhba. He says he is the Messiah. And everybody joins in this revolt against the Romans behind this false Messiah, except for the Christians. So you have the rejection of the Septuagint. You have Christians refusing to join the revolt, and this includes Jewish Christians. So the Jews start looking at Christians as traitors. So there's a lot of this coincidental, evidence that kind of points in that direction, that there certainly could have been a kind of anti-Christian bias behind this, but that's by no means certain, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how about the debate today? I know it's a debate that still rages on.
Mm-hmm.
Have there been any new developments, like archaeological, to prove, or other means to prove that Deuterocanon was considered scripture in the early times?
Yeah, there's so much out there. I mean, this is a subject I thought I'd write the book and be done with it, and I just keep tripping over more and more evidence. And so not only did I do the Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, the second edition through Catholic Answers Press, but I also did a book called The Case for the Deuterocanon. I also did some other stuff, and it just keeps going. Let me give you one piece that I think is really fascinating, and for some reason, practically no one knows about this. There are two fragments that we found of the Book of Sirach that was discovered in Masada and also at Qumran, okay? And what's interesting about these two fragments is that they were copied in a special format, special layout that is used almost exclusively in all the other fragments of the time for poetic biblical text, okay? So that's really fascinating because it shows that the authors of these fragments must have considered Sirach to be sacred. And this is from two Jewish communities, Masada and Qumran, at different times. Masada was near the end of the first revolt. Qumran goes all the way back to maybe the 1st century BC. So that's intriguing in and of itself. There's like 30 of these texts. All of them are biblical texts, all of them in the special format. And then you have these two texts from Sirach. And by the way, Sirach too, the rabbis, after they had their normative canon, they formed their Bible, even afterwards in their literature, they still cite Sirach in a very positive sense, like as if it carried some authority. So, there's all sorts of intriguing things like that. Also in Qumran, not only Sirach was found, but also Tobit. And that led lots of scholars believe that means this is those texts were probably considered sacred by the Qumran community as well. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, for sure. I mean, like you said, there's so much. I mean,
yeah,
the debate rages on. There's so much evidence out there that stuff just keeps coming. It's fascinating. And just one last question. I want to go to the New Testament briefly. I know I'm jumping around a bit. Okay. Are the Deuterocanons like referenced to or quoted in the New Testament?
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Yeah, that's a great question because, well, first we have to kind of clear the field. This is something that people get confused. Yes, they are used, and I think they're used in a way that is commensurate with a sacred inspired writing. I'll give you a couple examples. But before I do that, I need to point this out. Simply because a text is cited doesn't mean it was considered sacred or canonical. Okay?
Great point.
Yeah, because New Testament, Paul quotes pagan philosophers, the book of Enoch is quoted. So that by in its of itself doesn't prove it. And also, by the way, in the absence of quote doesn't prove anything either, because there's lots of proto-canonical books, the books that everybody accepts, that are never used in the New Testament. So it's not whether a text is cited or not. What's important is how it's used. Okay. And I'll give you one. I'll give you two. I promised you two, so I'll give you two. Well, the first one, let's go to Matthew 27:43. I love this text. Jesus is on the cross. Here's the context, and the crowd is jeering. They're taunting him while he's on the cross, and then the chief priests, scribes, and elders, they come alongside the crowd, and they kind of add to it. Now the crowd's saying, "You destroyed the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself if you're the Son of God. Come down from the cross." Okay. Now when the chief priests do their taunts, they kind of echo that, but they take it one step further. They say, "He saved others, he can't save himself, so he is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross and we'll believe in him." Okay. Now, so far, they're basically echoed the crowd, right? Jesus, prove that you're the Son of God, come down from the cross. But then they say something interesting. They flip it, and they actually want God to vindicate him. They say, "He trusted in God. Let God deliver him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God." Okay. So now they're saying, okay, let's see if God delivers them. Okay. And why do they have this expectation, or, this false expectation in their eyes? Well, because he stated, "I am the Son of God." So the question is, where in the world did the chief priests, scribes, and elders get a divine promise that God said, "I will deliver the person who truly is the Son of God"? Okay. Now, if you look in your cross references, you'll see a cross reference to Psalm 22:8, and that's certainly at work here. I'm not denying that. He relied on the Lord, let him deliver him. If he loves him, let him rescue. Okay. But what's missing is the key. Where's that claim to be the Son of God? Where's that claim that God would vindicate the true Son? Well, if you look in the Protestant Bible, there's nothing there, right? But if you look in the Catholic Bible, you see in Wisdom 2:18 that very promise. It says, "For if the just one be the Son of God, God will defend him and deliver him from the hands of his foes." So there is a divine promise. Okay. Now someone could say, well, maybe the chief priests, scribes, and elders, they use an apocryphal text. And I think that's just absurd, because if you think about it, okay, you have someone you believe is a false Messiah. You have the crowd around you, and here is your chance to, give the coup de grace, the final finish. And if the best thing you could do is cite an apocryphal text that no one accepts, that actually makes you look like a fool, and it backfires, right? Yes. Of all the scriptures, that's the best you can do. So, apparently, there must have been a sizable amount of people who accepted wisdom as an inspired text that does give this divine promise, and that gives weight to their jeering Jesus. So that's my first favorite one.
Okay.
The second one is in Hebrews 11:35. As you know, both you and I, we love Scripture. So, right. Hebrews 11 is the big faith chapter. It's all the men of old who gained approval, who faith was attested. And he goes through Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham, and all these biblical figures, right? He goes all the way through, and then he comes to Hebrews 11:35, and it says that there were some who could have. Oh boy, if I had the text in front of me, I don't. Hold on a second. And others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they may obtain a better resurrection. Now, who in the Protestant Bible was tortured? Okay, three things. Tortured, would not accept release for the sake of a resurrection. you won't find it anywhere in the Protestant Bible. But you do find that, by the way, in 2 Maccabees chapter 6 and 7, with the Maccabean martyrs. They were tortured, they accepted death, they were given release if they would recant, but they didn't. Why? Explicitly for the resurrection. Now the key here is that Hebrews 11, these are all biblical figures, right? Noah, Abraham, Isaac, David, Jephthah. These are all scriptural figures. So for them to cite characters that are nowhere found in the Old Testament, but an apocryphal writing, is in that context doesn't make sense. In fact, it looks almost as if it's like bookends. He starts in Genesis. The last characters or figures he mentions is 2 Maccabees. So this apparently is the bookends of his Bible, which just so happens to conform perfectly with the Catholic canon.
Great point.
Yeah.
Well, Gary, you've given us a lot to chew on today. I mean, we're just barely touching the surface, of course, over the course of this 20-minute program. But I appreciate your work that you're doing for the church. Great work. Can you give our listeners a little? Where can they learn more about you and your work?
Oh, absolutely. You can either go to handsonapologetics.com, and it's all one word, or if you're interested in the books or CDs, it's GaryMichuta.com.
Great. Fantastic, Gary. Thank you very much for being on the program today. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you. Hold on.